They added subject to the jurisdiction thereof for a reason.
Exactly. It's in there for a purpose. But you wouldn't put that in there if you wanted anybody who just shows up to be, as a baby, to be a citizen, correct?
That's correct.
There's a difference between giving citizenship to the children of slaves, the children of those subject to the Middle Passage, the children of sharecroppers, and the children of those who were once considered property, and giving citizenship to the children of people who cross the border illegally, stay in taxpayer-funded luxury hotels, who receive free Xboxes, free cell phones, free flights around the country, and 3 square meals a day.
Welcome to No Border, No Country. We're talking about birthright citizenship today, and as it happened, there was a committee hearing on Capitol Hill, and our resident legal expert just happened to be one of the experts testifying. What was that like, Matt?
It was certainly interesting. This is a complicated issue. Birthright citizenship, at least under U.S. law, is when you acquire citizenship at birth by being born in the United States or by meeting certain conditions if you are born outside of the United States to U.S. parents.
And this is very controversial, and it's been that way for a long time because we've now got this thing called birth tourism where wealthy foreigners are coming here for the express purpose of having a baby here that will be an American citizen. You've got people racing to get over the Rio Grande so they can deliver that baby on one side of the river versus another. So it's fair to say it's been exploited or manipulated by a lot of people.
Yeah, it's been exploited or manipulated by a lot of people. The whole thing comes out of the end of the Civil War when Congress proposed the 14th Amendment in order to ensure that the newly emancipated slaves weren't deprived of their rights as American citizens by the former Confederate states. So it's, there's just all kinds of opportunities for controversy here.
So what prompted this hearing? Tell everyone, what is the Trump administration doing as it relates to birthright citizenship that's got it in the news?
So the Trump administration put out an executive order saying that the United States government is no longer going to recognize the children of illegal aliens as U.S. citizens. And the reason that the Trump administration is doing this is there is a case decided by the Supreme Court in 1898, I believe it was. The case, or actually, I'd have to double check the date of that, but in any case, it was in the late 1800s called Wong Kim Ark. And there was a gentleman named Wong Kim Ark whose parents were Chinese nationals who came to the United States under a treaty that the U.S. had with China in the late 19th century. That treaty allowed certain people to remain here as the equivalent of a green card. And so the question came up under the 14th Amendment, did Wong Kim Ark become a citizen? And the Supreme Court found that indeed he did, although there was a qualifier because the Supreme Court said that the reason that he did was because his parents were residing lawfully in the United States. For reasons that are a mystery to me, that opinion has been misinterpreted and has been read by lawyers, legislators, and members of the general public as saying that anyone born on the territory of the United States becomes a U.S. citizen.
And as was raised in the hearing, there are little to no countries in the world that have anything close to a policy like this, right?
So there's about 30 countries in the world out of, I think we're at 196 total countries now. The places that have this that most similar to the United States are in Latin America, although there's a number of restrictions in Latin America that make it somewhat distinct. So really the only place that has a policy like this that's like 99% similar to ours is Canada.
So let's check out this hearing because as you might expect, there were a lot of open borders or anti-borders Democrat Congress people there who were just off the hook with crazy statements and grandstanding and things of that nature. So
Yeah, this has sort of been presented by the anti-borders contingent as this is very clear, and how could anybody not understand what this means? But of course, that argument is silly because it was confusing enough that it went all the way to the Supreme Court in Wong Kim Ark.
So the first clip we're going to look at was you being questioned by Representative Dan Goldman, Democrat from New York, who you and he have a little history together. You two squared off in a previous committee hearing, and he kind of beclowned himself.
My buddy Dan is good at that.
Yeah. So let's take a look at this, and I'll hear what you have to say.
Why is a visa holder not lawfully present in the United States with consent of the sovereign?
Well, first of all, a visa holder is a person who has a permit to board a common carrier and come to the United States and request admission. A person who has been admitted to the United States by the appropriate authorities following inspection by an immigration officer is lawfully present.
So someone with a visa, a work visa that could go on for years and years, you're saying is not lawfully present?
No, that's not what I said at all. I said a person who has been admitted in a visa classification, like H-1B, F-1, so on and so forth, is lawfully present while they're in compliance with the terms of the immigration laws.
Okay.
So, Matt, it sounded like he was trying to put words in your mouth there.
Well, this is what Mr. Goldman does. I mean, he's a pretty smart guy with a good education. For some reason, he's just always trying to go for a gotcha moment. And what he was confusing is a visa, even though everybody refers to someone's visa status, is actually the piece of paper that the Department of State puts into your passport. And that doesn't guarantee you admission to the United States. It's a two-phase process. You go for an interview at the U.S. consulate in front of a consular officer, and that person decides that, yes, you appear to be admissible to the United States. They put the sticker in your passport, you arrive at the border, and you show that to an immigration inspector. The immigration inspector, just because you have a visa, doesn't have to admit you. And when the immigration inspector admits you to the United States, there is an authorized period of admission. So we talk about illegal aliens. They fall into two classes. There's what in the immigration business we call entrants without inspection, who are people who snuck into the United States. And then we have overstays, which are people who entered lawfully, but they stayed longer than their admission permitted them to do, and so they become illegal aliens once their authorized period of admission expires.
So another congressman we had here, now this guy made a lot of sense. Wesley Hunt from Texas, he had an exchange here or a part of his statement that was really relevant. So let's take a listen to that.
I understand more than anyone that we are a nation of immigrants, but there's a difference. Stark difference between giving citizenship to the children of slaves, the children of those subject to the Middle Passage, the children of sharecroppers, and the children of those who were once considered property, and giving citizenship to the children of people who crossed the border illegally, staying in taxpayer-funded luxury hotels, who receive free Xboxes, free cell phones, free flights around the country, and 3 square meals a day. There's a big difference.
Matt, we had Pastor David Lowry and Kevin McGarry on here recently, and they were talking about the impact of some of these anti-borders policies on the black community. And this is just like one more insult to them, isn't it? Because that amendment was designed with their ancestors in mind.
Yeah, there's no indication whatsoever that Congress, when it passed the 14th Amendment, was attempting to grant citizenship to foreign nationals who are unlawfully present in the country. What they were trying to do is they were trying to ensure that the rights of the newly emancipated slaves who had become U.S. citizens were treated as citizens. And in the Reconstruction South, many of the governments there were angry about having lost the Civil War, and they did not treat the newly emancipated slaves the way that they should have treated them according to the law. So the 1866 Civil Rights Act was the first attempt to remedy that situation, and that used the phrase, everyone born in the United States and not subject to a foreign power. There were some in Congress who didn't think that that phrase went broadly enough. So when they put it into the 14th Amendment, they said not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Problem is, most modern observers read this and go, well, everyone knows what jurisdiction is. That means they're subject to the laws of the United States. But at the time that the 14th Amendment was passed, jurisdiction had two meanings. There was the legal meaning, which is, yes, you fall within the ambit of the law's authority in this particular geographical location. And then there was political jurisdiction, which had to do with your allegiance. And so somebody who is unlawfully present in the United States is definitely subject to the laws. If they weren't subject to the laws, the way that people think of diplomats as not being subject to the laws, then we wouldn't be able to deport them in the American courts as we do. They're subject to the laws of the United States, but they're not subject to the political jurisdiction thereof. We can't tell those people what to do from a political standpoint the way that other nations can the citizens of their own nations, because those people are still citizens of a foreign country. And if you'd stop and think about this, why would Congress propose that you are going to bar certain types of people from the United States solely on the basis of their citizenship? There's nothing discriminatory about this. It's a legal classification. We draw these kind of distinctions all the time. 14-year-olds can't drive cars. 16-year-olds can't vote. Unless you're 18, you can't buy cigarettes. If you're not 21, you can't drink. This is exactly the same kind of classification. If you are a citizen of France, the way the law is set up in the United States, you need the permission of the U.S. to come here. If you don't have the permission, you're an illegal alien. Why would Congress say, you're illegal, you're a citizen of a foreign country, therefore we can deport you, but then allow you to give your kids United States citizenship merely due to the fact that you happen to be in the United States when you give birth to the child? It doesn't make any sense if you stop and think about it.
I believe you were asked about this during the testimony, but I think one of the questions put to you was, what is the incentive for these couples in other countries to get here, have that child, and then oftentimes go back to their home country? What's the game?
Well, sure. There's this thing called birth tourism, and essentially it does two different things. In one case, if the parents want to stay here, even though there's nothing in the law that says the parents of U.S. citizen children can't be deported, the fact is that immigration judges, improperly so, very frequently will be hesitant to deport people who have U.S. citizen children, because the way that situation works is if the parents are being deported, they can either give up custody of the children, allow them to stay with a relative or a friend who has authorization to be in the United States, or the children can go with the parents to the place where the parents have citizenship, and the children who are U.S. citizens can travel into the United States to visit relatives. They can come and go at will. And then when they reach the age of majority, if they want to live separately from their parents in the United States because they're citizens, they can come here. The other kind of birth tourism is people who are not necessarily themselves interested in staying in the United States will have a child here. The child becomes a U.S. citizen. Before they leave the United States, they apply for a passport for the child. They keep renewing that passport. And the child can go back to the United States, and in a lot of cases can sometimes, even while living abroad, get certain benefits from the government. Now, both of the people in those classes have now created a U.S. citizen child who can sponsor their parents to get permission to reside permanently in the United States and then subsequently become a citizen. Once those parents are citizens, they can sponsor other family members. So this doesn't go in a straight line. Brian Lonergan gets admitted to the United States, and then he gets one person who gets one person who gets one person. It's a geometric progression. It's kind of like the old shampoo commercial about, and she told one friend, and he told one friend, and it just expands from there. And so that's where the term anchor babies comes from. And this is one of the major problems with the U.S. immigration system generally. Before you even get to questions of citizenship, an immigration system should work to the benefit of the country that is running it, meaning the United States should say something like, we don't have enough coal miners. There's a lot of coal miners in Wales. we're going to recruit people to come here from Wales and become coal miners in the United States and practice their trade. We don't do that. Family-based visas are whoever happens to come here, which they usually wind up coming here as a result of some kind of conflict. So after the Vietnam War, we had an influx of Vietnamese. After the Afghan and Iraqi wars, we had an influx of Afghans and Iraqis. Geopolitical conditions prior to that resulted in like a lot of Dominicans coming to the United States. So they then become the first link in the chain, and those people can sponsor other people to come to the United States. So you tend to get it in groups, not that the U.S. selected, but that are self-selecting groups of people. And the same thing works to a certain extent in employment-based immigration because U.S. employers make the decision. And they're not always looking out for the best interests of the American public or the well-being of the country. They're looking to make a profit. So they tend to recruit workers from places where the workers are willing to work for lower wages. So they come to the United States. While they're in the immigration process, they accept a lower wage. And then those people become the anchor in the family immigration process. And they also frequently are a source of referrals for companies to recruit other foreign nationals to become workers in the United States.
All right, here's one more clip of Wesley Hunt.
Now, the left has spent decades cheapening what it means to be an American citizen. They've quite literally been chipping away at the basic value of American citizenship. They pretend to be altruistic, but we know the truth. Ozzy Osbourne's daughter said on The View that we have to let illegal immigrants in this country because who else will clean our toilets? We hear it all the time. Who will pick our crops? And even though that we know that American citizens are the majority of those people picking our crops, we know what you're insinuating. And all this must end now.
Doesn't what Wesley Hunt said there really cut to the core of a lot of these pro-illegal immigration people that, I mean, they want people to vote for the candidates they want, the party they want, but don't they also really want this permanent serf class that's going to be available for very cheap labor?
Well, yeah. I mean, he brought up two key points. So the first of those, and I've been saying this for years. I mean, you and I have worked together for years. I'm sure you've heard me say it before. That thing, well, who's going to clean our toilets and pick our crops? It's ridiculous. We had a war from 1861 to 65 over that same issue. The other thing is it doesn't solve any problems because eventually, putting aside the implicit racism and condescension in, it's great for migrants to come here and clean the toilets, but we don't want them to compete for spaces at Harvard with our kids. That is just disturbing in and of itself. But when you stop and think about this, that's not a permanent solution. I mean, if you accept that on its face, it's not a permanent solution to anything because eventually somebody declares an amnesty, those people become legal. Now they can force employers to pay them the legally mandated wages and benefits. And then the employers just go looking for a new crop of people that they can exploit. And, whether that be child labor or illegal alien labor, it doesn't really make any difference. So there's a huge policy issue there that's implicated. And then it's hard to overstate the national security implications of this. I don't need to go over again what I covered in the clip because our viewers are seeing the clip directly. But what I didn't even get to because of the time limits while you're in a hearing, those people can run for public office. And, anybody that's familiar with cinema history, there's a fantastic old movie with Frank Sinatra and I forget who else was in it called The Manchurian Candidate, where a foreign government takes a U.S. prisoner of war and brainwashes him so that he becomes sympathetic to the adversary's views. And then they run him for president of the United States. Now, if you take the, brainwash mind control thing out of that, that's a very real possibility. And of course, there was a movie, because, Hollywood loves these kind of things, or at least it used to before it became woke. There was a movie with Kevin Costner in it where he plays.
Way Out.
Yeah,
Great movie.
Fantastic movie. Yeah. And he was a naval officer who was born of Russian parents, was a U.S. citizen by birth. And he is a Soviet mole. So both those movies are well worth watching because they have interesting approaches to these things. But this is not just fiction. This was actually done by the Russians during the Cold War. The Russians had two different programs. One was called the Legals Program, and the other one was called the Illegals Program. So the Russians encouraged people who the KGB had trained to either marry U.S. citizens and have children with them who would be U.S. citizens, sympathetic U.S. citizens, fellow travelers who believed in communism. Or they had another program where they snuck people into the United States with professionally forged documents that were very hard to detect. And they had children who were born on U.S. soil. So the children would then be raised by these KGB spies operating as a U.S. citizen in the United States and then trained to engage in espionage and foreign influence tactics against the United States, despite the fact that they were citizens. And again, we can turn to Hollywood for an example of this. There's a great show called The Americans. I have been for a long time studying national security studies. I'm about to finish a doctorate in it. And they actually referred to that show in a couple of the classes that I took on intelligence. And people who had spent years working for the DIA and the CIA on this program said, yeah, this is not a true story in terms of names of the people. They were like, but everything in this is 100% accurate. And we knew this, and we were trying to keep an eye on these people and figure out what they were up to. So it's very easy to dismiss this and go, that's just silly. This isn't going to happen. It's just people having kids, and they're going to be raised here. But the tone in this country has changed significantly over the last few decades, and there is no guarantee that a child raised in the United States, merely because he or she is raised in the United States, is going to be patriotic.
Yeah. You mentioned The Americans. Another fantastic show. When I was watching that when it first came out, it just so happened a guy who lived near where I worked was a former KGB officer, high-ranking, who was now here. And we had talked about this a lot, and he had told me that illegals program was very real, that was not some figment of some Cold War fantasy imagination. It was a real thing.
No, and if the Russians had it, then you can bet that the Chinese had something similar. Other of the bigger republics in the Soviet Union, like East Germany and possibly places like North Korea, have had these things. So it's a serious national security issue, and the other thing is when we're talking about people who are born as U.S. citizens but then leave the country, you can also have a child here who is a U.S. citizen, take them back to wherever, put them through the equivalent of the KGB academy in their own country, and then have them come here. And they show up with a U.S. passport, fully trained to do whatever. And, the traditional model of war that we're all used to from what we've studied in school is World War I and World War II, where there is the military forces of a nation engaged in some kind of invasion or action. There's no guarantee that has to be the model in the future. And so we're increasingly seeing things where people have exploited the immigration system to come into the United States. The 9/11 attacks were carried out by people who had lawfully entered the United States. The Boston Marathon bombings, same thing. This takes that to the next level. And so if you have an adversary with the logistical capabilities and with time to wait, then this is an ideal way to implant an enemy into the United States in a way that we can't get rid of the person. Because if the person is a citizen, you can't denaturalize them because they, by definition, haven't naturalized. And you can't deport them because they're a U.S. citizen. And U.S. citizens are the only people who have a legal right to leave and re-enter the United States.
Another member of Congress who was there questioning was Jamie Raskin. Anyone who follows politics recognizes this guy. He's got severe Trump derangement syndrome, as radical as they get. He was making a point about some of these lower court decisions about this. So I want to watch this and then tell me what you think.
Take a look at what they said. Here's Judge Kuhnauer, who was nominated by President Reagan. Citizenship by birth is an unequivocal constitutional right. It's one of the precious principles that makes the United States the great nation that it is. The president cannot change, limit, or qualify this constitutional right by executive order. I can't remember a case that presented a question as clear as this, says Judge Kuhnauer.
Jamie Raskin seemed to be avoiding you, Matt. He didn't want to tangle with you. I think he learned from Dan Goldman's previous experience. But if you could have responded to him there, what would your response have been there?
Well, first of all, it's kind of ironic when Jamie Raskin is saying that you can't monkey with the Constitution in order to pass policy, because that's basically what he does on a regular basis. So for our viewers that don't know this, I believe that Mr. Raskin came up through state politics in Maryland, and in College Park, or the town next door, he sponsored a bill to give non-citizens the right to vote. So
That's right.
Illegal aliens were permitted to vote in local city council and school board elections. And his reasoning for this was, well, they're here, they're part of the community, they're good citizens, which is the way the anti-borders contingent always refers to these people, even though they're not lawfully here, they call them good citizens. And he said, well, since these people are in the community, they ought to be able to determine the political course of the community. Now, if you stop and think about that for a minute, that's exactly the problem that I was addressing in response to Mr. Hunt's questions. So if you're not here lawfully and you're not part of the polity, you don't have full membership in America, you're not entitled to make any decisions about the political future of the country. So it's just mind-boggling to hear him saying this. And then, the stunt with the giant poster boards with quotes on them. That's great, but those are quotes from district court judges. So there's a couple of things that need to be taken into account for that. For somebody to be going, well, 4 or 5 district court judges, well, there's hundreds, if not thousands of them across the federal courts. The fact that they ruled a particular way on a case and that there's 4 or 5 of them that did is not an indication of anything. It's an indication of a trend, but it doesn't mean that they're right. Secondly, district court cases are not precedential beyond the facts of the case that is before the court. And general principles typically come from the appellate courts and the Supreme Court. Second of all, that whole argument is just absurd, because clearly this case went all the way to the Supreme Court in Wong Kim Ark. So it's not as plain on its face as people would claim, who are in support of a policy that we allow everyone born in the United States to become a citizen. As we said at the beginning of the podcast, this is largely a misreading. The question that was addressed in Wong Kim Ark was whether the child of lawfully present parents who had the equivalent for that historical period of a green card becomes a citizen at birth. The court never touched, never got near, never addressed the question of illegal aliens. And I maintain that they couldn't have done that, because at the time, America was trying to recruit people. We had a huge, vast, empty space of a country, and we needed people to log and farm and build things. And so we were trying to recruit people. And the law at that time prohibited the admission of convicts, people who had a criminal conviction, people who were clinically insane, and people who were likely to become public charges. Everyone else who wanted to come here had to pay a 50-cent admission tax to be admitted to the United States, which sounds laughable now, but was a king's ransom then. And then they could, as long as they were in compliance with the law, they could stay as long as they wanted. So were there some people that we would call illegal aliens now in the country then? Yes. Was that concept understood the way it is now? No. It wouldn't be until just before the First World War that concept started to take root, and then it was really after the Immigration and Nationality Act, the first iteration of it was put in place, that really became a thing. So to say that either Congress, in putting together the 14th Amendment, was even considering foreign nationals who were not here in large numbers, it was before the age of rapid travel, and to say that the courts at the same time were considering this, it's just absurd, because this just was not a thing for anyone then.
Congressman Glenn Grothman from Wisconsin, I believe he was the committee chair the last time you testified
Yes.
on the Hill, and you and he had a pretty good exchange here. Check this out.
Was there any indication at that time that in the hypothetical that the opponents of President Trump cite today, was there any indication that the drafters of the amendment believed that if somebody just came here as a visitor or whatever, we talk about, people coming from China and landing in San Diego or whatever, that the equivalent would have resulted in people being a citizen? Is there any evidence of that in 1865, 1866?
No, the court in Wong Kim Ark was very explicit when it said that it was referring to people who were residing in the United States with the permission of the government.
There's no evidence of any of the debaters at that time saying, whoosh, we're opening the door to become American citizen to anybody who gets off, just gets off a boat.
No, and I think if you stop and think about the way the amendment was drafted, if that's what they wanted, they could have just left the qualifying statement out and said anyone born in the United States is a citizen. But they added subject to the jurisdiction thereof for a reason.
Exactly. It's in there for a purpose. It's an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. You wouldn't put that in there if you wanted anybody who just shows up as a baby to be a citizen, correct?
That's correct.
It seems like if you read that clause correctly, they were pretty clear on what they were trying to do there, weren't they?
Yeah, if you know how to read it, and I don't say that in any kind of a condescending way, that is legalese. And the opinion Wong Kim Ark itself is very hard to read. It's very sort of wandering and discursive. But if you boil the thing down to its essence, it comes down to what is the legal interpretation of the clause subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And modern readers have a tendency, and even modern lawyers have a tendency to go, and this is how we started the podcast, we're coming full circle here, to read that and go, oh, it means the person has to obey the laws. Except that's not what it means. We know that that's not what it means because the senators that sponsored the bill, who were Senators Trumbull and Howard, I believe, said that in the debates. They said, no, this is not what we mean by this. What we mean is somebody who is subject to the complete political jurisdiction, meaning they have a legal allegiance to the United States, or by extension to whatever state they're born in. And so the way this needs to be read is that people who are present in the United States in compliance with the law, lawful permanent residents in particular, fall into a special class of people. They're the only ones who can apply for naturalization in the United States. And since we can infer from those people's lawful and lengthy residence in the United States that they would prefer to remain here, and frequently do, some of them seek citizenship, I would say most of them, but some of them don't, that we can infer that those people's children are going to remain here with them and that therefore they have an allegiance to the United States. There is a rule when you interpret statutes, and particularly the Constitution, that you don't read things as being superfluous. There is a presumption that a constitution or a statute uses the language it needs in order to express the goal, the objective that it is trying to fulfill, and that you don't ignore words. And so, as I said during the hearing, if Congress wanted this to be everyone who was born in the United States, then they could have just said, all persons born in the United States are citizens, period. But they didn't do that. The other side in this issue claims that The purpose for which subject to the jurisdiction thereof was put into the amendment was to exempt diplomats who are representatives of foreign countries who are not subject to prosecution in the United States, generally not subject to the laws the same way that the rest of us are, and who remain in allegiance to the country that sent them here, that they don't fall within the ambit of the 14th Amendment. The other group was Indians, who at the time, Indians living on reservations who were members of a tribe, were considered to be small sovereigns within the United States. And the last category of people that they specifically talked about in the decision was enemy aliens, foreign military forces who were here in the United States. However, to read Wong Kim Ark as referring to those three groups of people as an exhaustive list is inappropriate. They referred to the obvious examples. As I said, illegal aliens weren't quite a thing at that point in time, so there was no reason why the court needed to address that. And nowhere in the opinion did they say, this is the only group of people that Congress is talking about. We can't ever consider anyone else. So this is the whole notion that that's what the 14th Amendment accomplished, and that the holding in Wong Kim Ark gave citizenship to anyone born in the United States is just, it's based on a misinterpretation, and it has become a part of American folklore, but it's not what the Supreme Court said. And as Congressman Hunt pointed out, that is not what Congress was attempting to do at the time. They were attempting to protect emancipated slaves so that they could get what Abraham Lincoln conferred upon them with the Emancipation Proclamation, and so that slavery in the United States would be ended once and for all.
Now, up until this point in the hearing, it was a fairly sober discussion, debate, talk about legal concepts and interpretations and all of this. At this point, we veered off into clown world.
Yes, we did.
There is a member of Congress who I have never heard of before. I don't know if you have, but by all accounts, she's trying to get admission into the squad with AOC and Ilhan Omar because she was as unhinged as I've ever heard a congressman before. Sydney Kamlager-Dove from California then took her turn to make her statement. Let's hear this.
And I now recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. I think there's a quick video that I have.
You don't need to be a genius to realize that Trump's not talking about babies that come from Norwegian vajayjays. No, he wants to white out the Constitution so that he can whiten America. That's what he's planning to do here.
All right, I just thought since, the South Africans are in the news, I would play that.
So we're in a hearing before Congress. She plays a clip of a stand-up comic who's not even an American citizen making a vulgar joke about how Trump is racist because he wants only white immigrants. How inappropriate and offensive was that?
Well, I'm just wondering if the Norwegian medical establishment had some kind of a kickback to her so that could get mentioned. That was the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. So first of all, Trevor Noah is just not funny. Calling him a comedian is a slander against comedians that are actually funny, like Jerry Seinfeld and Bill Burr, and people who can actually tell a joke and make you laugh. I don't understand people's fascination with him in the first place. But why you would cite him as some kind of authority on the 14th Amendment as it applies to birthright citizenship, I have no idea. But, clearly she was trying to advance the argument that denying people birthright citizenship is racist. But the comments she was making were racist because immigrants are not a race. So this affects anyone. And the only reason that the most significant portion of migration coming to the United States right now comes from Latin America, Asia, and Africa is because of geopolitical conditions. We don't know if there's going to be a natural disaster, a war, anything that drives other groups of people to come here. The Ukrainian war, I've been doing immigration for 30 plus years at this point, and I rarely saw a Ukrainian, with the exception of when I was working in New York, in upstate New York, And most of the Ukrainians that I encountered were the children and grandchildren of Ukrainians. I worked with a deportation officer whose father was from the Ukraine, but I can't recall ever having encountered, more than a tiny handful of Ukrainians who were facing deportation. However, those numbers are going to increase because the Russia-Ukraine war happened, and we allowed a large number of people into the U.S. on temporary protected status and asylum and refugee status. So this whole notion that immigrants, as the other side on this issue likes to say, are brown people, it is just dopey and racist in and of itself. And I think it goes back to what Congressman Hunt was talking about, that, there's this presumption that everyone who falls within that end of the color spectrum is somehow uneducated and is going to come here and clean toilets. And it's the most offensively racist thing in the entire world. But then she went on with these, trying to get a gotcha moment. And it's like, what does the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment have to do with this?
Well, here at Early, we've researched and written a lot about this birth tourism industry. And one of the things we've seen over many years is that a vast majority of the people who are exploiting this tend to be wealthy Chinese parents who are coming over here. So the idea that Trevor Noah is putting out there is just plain false.
Yes, it's absolutely absurd. And let me say, Kamlager-Dove, I had not heard of that name before, and when I first heard it, I thought it was an experimental music group like Bachman Turner Overdrive or something like that.
That sounds better than this. Yeah. All right. I'd like to tell you it got better after that for her, but unfortunately it got much, much worse.
No, it got much, much worse for her and for all of us who were there.
So listen to this.
So I want to talk about the times that gave rise to the 14th Amendment. It was 1868. There was the aftermath of the 4-year divisive, destructive Civil War that killed roughly 750,000 soldiers, or 2% of the population. Resistance in the form of Reconstruction, a massive tsunami in a soon-to-be U.S. territory that killed 70 people, and in the aftermath of the 1868 Louisiana Constitution, which gave black men the right to vote and a public education, you had the Louisiana Massacre, where black people were murdered trying to vote. As people would say from my hood in L.A., the white folks went cray-cray.
The white folks went cray-cray. Is that appropriate to be talked about in the Congress?
Of course, Brian. That is a special legal argument that's only brought out in the most serious and sober of circumstances. What a buffoon this woman is. I mean, not only is she historically and legally ignorant. I mean, yes, the Civil War did happen, but the suggestion that people who are the same color as her don't get due process in the United States, isn't that assertion kind of negated by the fact that she's sitting there in Congress with everyone else across the color spectrum who is a member? I mean, you were sitting in that room with me. It was like the Rainbow Coalition. So this whole notion that this is all about keeping America white is offensive. And even if that were the case, I think it's a little too late for that if you're looking around the room. And then the other thing that this is, the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment bakes equal protection and due process into the American experience. How? That makes no sense. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that citizenship, nationality, is a legal distinction and a valid non-discriminatory one. And in a case called Matthews v. Diaz, the Supreme Court said flat out, the Congress regularly makes laws that, if applied to citizens, would be unconstitutional, but are perfectly legitimate and constitutional when applied to foreign nationals. There's a ring around the United States at the border that the U.S. government has the legal authority to say, hey, when you hit this ring, if you're not American, we determine whether you get in, if you do get in, how long you stay, and when you have to go home.
So if your appetite for this kind of buffoonery hasn't been satisfied, we have one more clip of her.
origin story of the amendment is as applicable now as it was then. You had a Democratic president impeached in 1868 and a Republican president impeached in 19 and 21. You had political violence in 1968 with the Louisiana Massacre and an insurrection that happened here in 2021 where Capitol Police were speared with American flags. You had a tsunami in Hawaii in 1868 and a fire again in 2023. You had an economic turndown in 1868 and you have $15 eggs under Trump right now in 2025. Same environment, toxic, hostile, destructive, deadly.
Matt, I lost track of how many absurdities are in that statement.
I don't even know where to begin. The assertion that the end times are near because this parallels 1868, I don't understand where that comes from. I'm just going to leave that one aside. There's probably another great Hollywood movie about that, 2012 maybe. It's not the one with the Earth is going to end because the Mayan calendar.
Yes.
So in any case, I don't know what she was talking about. To go back to what she said at the beginning of that clip, it's shocking that congressmen showed up to debate this. Well, what she's leaving out of that is the historical fact that the 14th Amendment itself was passed by Republicans, members of Abraham Lincoln's party, who wanted to abolish slavery and keep the Union together. The congressmen who showed up to debate it were Democrats. And they were Democrats who had come from the former Confederacy. And there's not much more to say on that. And her insistence that Scalia was in favor of this, well, that issue was never before the court, so I don't know when Justice Scalia would have commented on it. And her notion that this is based on originalism, no, the 14th Amendment wasn't based on originalism. Originalism is the legal philosophy that to properly interpret a constitution or a statute, you have to look at the words and figure out what they meant legally at the time, not consider the intellectual climate of the times.
Just to compound how unprofessional that was, this is a hearing regarding immigration policy, and yet she's got this checklist. She's got to reference January 6th. She's got to blame Trump for inflation, which has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but it's like she's got to get in these party talking points.
No, I found myself wanting to take a dozen of those $15 eggs and pitch them in her direction at the time. I'm joking, just for anyone, because we know what the political climate is like now. Yeah, it was shocking how many things she raised that didn't have anything to do with the subject being debated, but, she was attempting to weave a particular narrative, and that has something, it has to go something along the lines of Donald Trump is the second coming of evil itself or whatever. I mean, it just the whole testimony from beginning to end was uninformed, absurd, and quite frankly offensive. Now, I may have interpreted that way because, look at me, I must be cray-cray.
Does it seem to you that their arguments are all out of steam? The public has spoken on this. The fact that Trump got elected with such a strong border security agenda just shows that the public doesn't support them anymore. So they have to, not that they've never not done this, but they have to resort to just shameless playing of the race card, distractions, bomb throwing, anything to get the subject off a sober, serious discussion about the problem and a common sense solution to it.
Yeah, responding to somebody saying that this should be beyond debate, Andrew McCarthy, who is a former U.S. attorney and is a frequent commentator on Fox News, and I believe has a column in National Review, he said it shouldn't be in any way controversial or offensive to suggest that we don't have birthright citizenship, and if that is the case, then perhaps that's not because birthright citizenship is a fundamental principle of the United States, but because we have forgotten what citizenship means if we're willing to give it to absolutely anyone who's born here in the U.S. So I don't know. Sitting there, it was like I was struggling to find the words to describe what I was hearing coming from the people in favor of keeping this, because most of it seemed to be emotional arguments. There were a lot of people saying, oh, think about the burden that this will impose. This is going to, Rome will fall if we do this, and nurses in hospitals will have to become genealogists. That's the dumbest thing in the entire world. There's no national system for determining citizenship now. If you're a native-born U.S. citizen, the only way you can get a document to prove that, beyond doubt, one single federal document, is to apply for a U.S. passport from the Department of State, which manages the exterior relations of the United States. So that whole notion is just moronic, because all that hospitals do is, if you're in a state where the hospital issues the birth certificate, the registrar of the hospital has a legal authority to issue it. And if you're not, the hospital communicates information to a state statistics office, which then issues a birth certificate. So I'm not sure where all this genealogy and family tree making is going to have to come.
Wasn't that an odd argument? But this was the professor who was the Democrats' witness at the table, that there was going to be this horrible burden on families to produce citizenship documents when the child was born. Given the amount of regulation we get from the government anyway, is that really such a burden to put on people?
No, it's not a burden. Like I said, it's an absolutely moronic argument. And the true reason that they're pushing that argument is because they want to portray Donald Trump as somebody who doesn't have any respect for the law or any respect for citizenship. So the implication is that the time is coming where the government is going to start saying, can I see your papers, please, like some cheesy villain from a 1940s black and white film. But the fact is, that's not going to happen. That's not what this does. And if you look at Donald Trump's record in the courts, he is and has repeatedly been found by the courts to be one of the most law-abiding and respectful of the rule of law presidents in the history of the United States. And these people are not seeing the things that they have done in the past, like the Biden administration completely ignoring the border and just waiving anyone who wanted to come in here to come in. Come on in, stay as long as you want. I mean, it's complete absurdity. That is disrespect for the rule of law. Congress has the authority to establish who can enter the United States, how long they can stay, and when they got to go. That has been repeated by the Supreme Court I don't know how many times since ECU v. United States, which was an 1892 case. So this whole notion that this somehow is the thread at the bottom of the 99-cent store sweater, that if somebody gently tugs on it, it's all going to come unraveled, is just one of the most absurd and, quite frankly, idiotic things that I've ever heard.
Now, anyone who's watched these kind of hearings before, there are often members of Congress who will make wacky statements and things, and oftentimes the other congressmen will just ignore it and move on to the next person. Chip Roy, who was the chair of this committee, and Tom McClintock, from a Republican from California, couldn't resist making a comment on Ms. Kamlager-Dove's absurdities. So check this out.
And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Well, I would just observe for the record that the phrase white people be cray-cray is itself cray-cray. And I will now recognize the gentleman from California.
And also racist, of course. I was wondering how long it would take the Democrats to play the race card, and I want to thank my colleague from California for satisfying that curiosity.
So after Representative McClintock made that statement, I was watching Ms. Kamlager-Dove, and she had kind of a irritated look on her face, and she packed up her little briefcase and stormed out of there. So,
yeah. All I think you have to do in order to figure out the difference in approaches there is pay attention to the hysterical, absurd, and quite frankly disjointed manner in which Ms. Kamlager-Dove made her point, and then Mr. McClintock very politely, very professionally, without getting hysterical, pointed out the absurdity in her argument in a way that, would pass muster at any social function that you could possibly go to, and nobody would consider it the least bit impolite. So it's I do not understand why this is always tied to race, why there's a suggestion that this is a fundamental American principle, because if you're talking about fundamental American principles, then allegiance to the country should be of importance. We all said the Pledge of Allegiance when we were in school. And of course, Congressman Goldman got up there and said, oh, allegiance is a fuzzy concept that you can't ever figure out what it means. And, tying this to race, as I said before, is just offensive because immigrants, migrants, whatever you want to call them, even illegal aliens, are not a race. I cannot tell you how many illegal alien Irish, French Canadian, Scandinavian, British, and Canadian people that I deported while I was a trial attorney at ICE. It's this notion that somehow this is a racial issue and that the Republicans aren't concerned with the rule of law but are afraid of the wave of the invading brown people. It's racist, it's offensive, and it's woefully inaccurate.
So in closing, Matt, what do you see is the future of birthright citizenship? Is it on the way out, or is it going to survive the Trump years? What do you see happening?
Well, politically, it's on the way out. I don't think the American public supports this anymore. I think that most people understand that it's just bad policy to want to enforce your immigration laws and secure your borders, but then you give anybody who breaks it the greatest gift in the entire world. They can give birth to a U.S. citizen and then use that child's citizenship as a lever for the whole entire family to get here. So as a political issue, I think the more people are exposed to things like this podcast and that hearing, and the more they do research into it and come to understand it, the less people support this. Legally speaking, it's difficult to say. The courts are generally loath to touch this kind of thing unless it comes to them in a statute passed by Congress or unless there is a serious split between the federal circuits in a holding on something like this. Right now, this is based on an executive action. It has been temporarily halted in a number of places, but there is, it doesn't look positive in those particular cases for the Trump administration winning, but who knows? One of these judges may do some research and go, yeah, I was mistaken about this. I've read the legislative history. So it's a tough call legally, but I mean, Early has been directly involved in some of these lawsuits. We think that the legal principle that is the one that we went up and testified on behalf of on the Hill, that this decision was limited to the children of lawful permanent residents. So now we just have to stop and let the procedures that we use in democracy and the common law take their course and see where this happens. Now, it is worth saying that, the Trump administration has secured the border to the point where I think one of the latest tallies of people attempting to come across the whole 3,000 miles of border was 229 versus 20 or 30,000 a day coming during the Biden administration. So if we ever got to a point where we had immigration enforced the way that it should be, this might not even really be that much of an issue. It's an issue because irresponsible border enforcement policies over decades by both Republicans and Democrats have allowed, prior to the Biden administration, there were arguments about an accurate estimate of illegal aliens in the United States, but it was, anywhere from 20 to 35 million would have been a legitimate call. And people think that the Biden administration let another 10 to 15 million into the United States. So there's 50 million people here who could be giving birth to U.S. citizens if this thing is not sorted out. And it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Congratulations, you made it to the end of the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the Immigration Reform Law Institute, go to irli.org. If you found this information useful and you'd like to support the show, go to irli.org/podcast. You can also hear this show on Apple Podcasts, Rumble, and Spotify. And don't forget to check us out on all the major social media platforms. Thanks again.